All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to start in just a minute. Just really quick, because we are a state agency, if anybody has any type of like Otter AI transcription software, we do ask that you turn that off. I'll make that announcement again in a little bit. All right, it's 2 o'clock, so we're going to get started because there's a lot to cover today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allie Dowds. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the consultant for special populations here at MBLC. I want to thank you all for attending today's panel, which is titled Emerging Trends in Public Library Services. This session is part of MBLC's 12-month series called Core Connections, Building Community Supports and Allyship at Your Library. And I will share a link to that later. And the session will focus on library trends and how we as a profession can look to drive change instead of react to it. Before I begin, I just want to send a big thanks to Laura Saunders. Laura is a professor and associate dean of Simmons University School of Library and Information Science, for entertaining this completely unformed idea I had months ago. And she really helped me to pull together this panel of creatively impressive minds, each who are deeply devoted to librarianship and its future. Laura couldn't be here today, and so she kindly handed the reins to me. So I hope I can represent her well. So with that, let me welcome the members on the panel. We have Cynthia Landrum, who is currently the Alan Smith Visiting Scholar in Residence at Simmons University School of Library and Information Science. Dr. Landrum most recently served as Deputy Director and Acting Director of the Office of Library Services at the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and brings nearly 30 years of experience in public library leadership. She's been active across local, state, and national professional associations, and her scholarship explores lists, futures, public librarianship, and the role of social justice in public libraries. Amy Pattee is a professor at the School of Library and Information Service Science at Simmons, specializing in children's and young adult literature. She co-coordinates the dual degree program with Simmons College's Center for the Study of Children's Literature. Dr. Pattee's research interests include youth librarianship, young adult literature, popular and serious fiction, magazines for teenage girls, girls' studies, and the intersections of reading and culture. Don Simmons, assistant professor, also at Simmons University, has worked at both public and academic libraries, managing programs for children, teens, and adults, leading outreach and community-based efforts, in addition to launching research in critical information literacy at West Chester Community College. Dr. Simmons's current research focuses on misinformation, algorithmic bias, and information privilege, with an emphasis on progressive pedagogical practices for one-shot instruction. Today's session will be recorded, and it will be shared with all registrants. A quick reminder that as a state agency, we are not allowed to have other recordings such as Otter AI. So if you have a recording, please disable at this time. So this is a panel, and it's a panel discussion. It's going to last about 30 to 35 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. So please use the Q&A feature. You can submit questions throughout the discussion. I also encourage, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please do so as well. So with that, let me welcome our panel. So hi, everyone. And before we dive into questions, I know I just gave a really formal introduction, high level about who you are. But if there's one thing you'd like the audience to know about you or your work, what would that be? And anyone can go first, so you can jump right in.
I will jump in. I think the one thing I would want people to know is I'm a trained futurist. So I think about my work within the framework of thinking about the future and strategic foresight.
Thank you.
So I'll jump in. First, thank you, Ali, for the introduction. Thank you for everyone being here. I would say the one thing I would like to add in order to kind of, provide more info about me is that when I first got into public libraries, I had no idea what I was doing. And I think that public library experience really helped me ground myself as a human being. I went straight into children's services. And I'm just like, what? I've never done this before. Like, I've never read a book in front of kids before and allowed to expand my horizon, not only as a person, but as a professional. And it really helped catapult my work and my research to where I'm at right now. So I'm extremely grateful for public libraries in general.
And hey, it's Amy. Uh, I'm trying to think of what exciting thing I could bring to the table, but unfortunately, the only exciting thing I can think of is exciting probably only to me. I have two soft spots in my heart for collection development and library policy, which we might be able to fit into the conversation a little bit later. And it is my life's work to convince people that these are indeed two interesting things to talk about.
Thank you all. So our questions for the panel today are going to focus on library trends in library services. And we really like hit the ground running because our first question is, um, could you talk about what is the most urgent content area being overlooked in list programs today? And conversely, what should working librarians be actively upskilling to stay ahead in the field?
So I can definitely jump into this question. I think the one thing that may not be necessarily overlooked, but something that LAS programs should focus more on are frontline services in terms of like creating a more comprehensive, streamlined, and robust module or set of educational resources as it pertains to what it takes to really become a public librarian. When for the past couple of years, I've been working with SLIS to find different ways that we can essentially like level up our public library course. And we've done several initiatives like connect with neighboring and local librarians at the public level. And they have noted that some graduate students that are coming in fresh into the public library system don't necessarily know the realities of public librarian work, in particular reference services. There is a sense of responsibility and sometimes tasks that aren't necessarily in your job responsibility, like making sure that you know the fundamentals of crisis management, de-escalation tactics, also being prepared for being ready to administer some form of aid to someone who may be struggling both emotionally and through some form of, overdose or drug, like knowing what a Narcan is, how to administer that. And I think when it comes to working on that subject area, I believe that we should focus more and double down more on case studies, more guest speakers, more of a, again, robust way of streamlining that content within our program so students are prepared to enter the field. And I think also what dovetails to another subject that I think we should be more hands-on about is teaching the differences or teaching the different libraries that are out there, particularly urban, suburban, and rural, because those three different libraries have their own unique set of characteristics and traits, especially when it comes to the ways that librarians are like social workers and librarians, crisis managers and librarians all at the same time, even though this isn't something that is on your job responsibility sheet. So I would say in terms of like content area, we should definitely focus on that more. And I would also say in terms of like actively upskilling for current librarians is to identify more social services that are, around your community. They kind of call it like community asset mapping, making sure that you can connect with your community more so you can serve your community in a better way, whether it's connecting with local youth organizations, food pantries, anything that you feel your patrons need the most. And I also believe that it's important, and I'm biased because I teach an AI course at SLIS, so please forgive me, but I do believe that it's our responsibility to infuse AI literacy within our existing information literacy, digital media literacy initiatives at the public library. Because I know that our ethical framework consists of anti-AI. I'm not really feeling this, which I totally respect, but I think our community residents who are trying to navigate the AI landscape also want to learn more about this new generative AI thing. And I think we could be the perfect bridge towards connecting our community with more of those resources so they can be more informed and also closing that digital divide gap, because again, that exists within AI as well.
Thanks, Don. And if I can just kind of, you started to, I think, you started to make this connection when you were talking about community mapping, because often when you go back to the whole like social service need or the psychosocial needs of patrons, and a big part of that discussion from current librarians, new librarians, future librarians is that's not what I signed up for. That's not part of my job, or I wasn't prepared for this. Can Don or somebody else maybe make some of those connections? Not saying you're supposed to be an EMT or you're supposed to be a social worker, but where are those connections in public service that connect those two things that are part of our jobs?
Well, I will jump in as a former public librarian who has worked in libraries where we've had very robust social service orientations and full departments. I think even we are we serve information seekers, right? And so even in the bare minimum of our work, we are engaging with people, and this is even before I think we were thinking about social service and human services models in public library, and I'm probably going to show my age when I say some of these things. But we've always had some form of information dissemination in relation to some of these things. It became probably more prominent, I would say, in my own career, maybe in the mid 2000s, where I found myself doing more of this work, but it's still technically reference work. I was a reference librarian. I still um, defined it and classified it as part of my reference work. If someone is coming in to ask me, hey, I want to know, can you tell me where the closest, food bank is? Or I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this, social service website because the city says in order for me to get services, I don't know even where to begin. So I think it's always, at least the last 30 years, been a part of our work. I think it's just shown up differently, but ultimately, to me, it's still a reference information service or provision.
Thanks, Cindy. We'll move on to the next question. So, question two is, where can libraries look to, or how can they leverage strategic partnerships to recognize societal trends that will have impacts on library services?
I'm going to speak to the
Yeah.
youth services context, so it'll be a little bit more narrow, but it will also be within the public library services continuum. So I think that as Don and Cindy have both mentioned, it is more important now than ever for libraries and public libraries to be connected with, in myriad ways, to social service agencies in their communities and to be connected to their communities. And I think about some of the sometimes ridiculous barriers that exist between libraries and community organizations. And I would encourage youth serving librarians to reach out to some of the existing youth serving organizations that are around here that have, that have and sometimes restrict young people's access to information just because of the rules of youth participation in these organizations or spaces. So here I'm thinking about places where youth serving librarians can and should get out of the library and go to places like the YMCA and the Boys and Girls Club, where after school, a lot of times young people who go there aren't allowed to leave. And if they do leave, they're not allowed to come back. And if a young person is not allowed to leave, say, a Boys and Girls Club or a YMCA, the chances that they're going to make it to the library are pretty slim. So we see an opportunity there with organization or organizations that are providing services to young people that, because of the rules, are restricting their access to the library. We can bring the library to them. We can bring our services to them, and we can in that activity start really building relationships with the young people in our community, and start to, as we become more familiar with the people who work in these organizations, start to think of ways that we can really work together and help to shape that information world that our young people live in.
I would also add to even figure out like who should I be talking to, where should I be going. Sometimes just showing up, like sending staff out to community meetings to listen, to hear what are the issues. This is part of your community asset mapping or your community assessment work. Sometimes just sitting in meetings and listening. I can remember being um, uh, assistant director of public services and going to a community meeting about, I can't even remember, it was like about snow removal. It was something that didn't even seem related to the library, but sitting in that meeting was so informative because I was learning about things that the community thought were important and things they absolutely did not care about, which was really helpful in thinking about, okay, well, where is the library situated in some of this work? Where could we be situated that we're not?
And one quick added point, because I think that Amy and Cindy just mentioned awesome points. I think the one thing that I really want to touch on, which Amy mentioned, is reaching out to local organizations that help with youth empowerment. Can't stress that enough, because now talking about social trends, a big trend now is young people, young users, young high school students entering either college, higher ed, or the workforce, and the economy and the cost of living is just pounding them with a big weighted vest. And I think when we connect with local YM, YWCAs, other local organizations, we can actually see where the need is, so we can have invited guests at the library, invite these groups from these organizations, and have either community college representatives talk about affordable opportunities for them to access higher ed, so then they can potentially get their associates or transfer to another college with some form of funding, or vocational representatives to talk about the ways that after high school they can have a pipeline to a career where if you don't want to go to college, that's fine. No hate on that plan, but at least there is a plan, and these are the options that you have locally.
Yeah, I love all these points too. And it's Cindy, your comment about like the snow removal is like reminding me of a meeting I was in the other day. And I had brought in a speaker that was like somewhat connected to the topic, but it was, kind of like, oh, let's see where this goes. And by the end, just like that spitballing and networking and kind of understanding how everyone could be somewhat useful to each other's worlds was like really cool to see, and then like that energy that sparks out of that. So entering that meeting, I think a lot of people might have felt, oh, how am I going to use this resource? Or how is that relevant to what we're talking about? Or that maybe that's just interesting. And by the end, it really ended up being this big social connection. And I feel like all of you are touching on that, especially when you talk about youth and that social connection to a library, which is really this creative forum for thought, right? And ideas. And to use, I always talk about one of the things I think is most underrated about a library is just its actual space and how that space becomes a place for so many things, and where that can lead. So I'm glad you all like touched on those bits a lot. We're going to take a little bit of a turn, and we're going to talk about AI. And as I know, that is a really I'm going to say common or popular topic today, especially in libraries. So, where are you seeing AI make the most surprising impact in public libraries right now? And what specific competencies should public librarians build in order to navigate this new AI landscape?
All right, I'm going to double dutch my way into this question because I think when it comes to AI, it's always tricky. It's really nasty work because I do think that it's a complicated space to move around. So, to give the audience full transparency and context, I teach the AI course at Simmons, where we highlight all of the practical ways that AI can be used at the public library level, school library level, academic level, and other areas in LAS, along with like the social political issues that we have here. There was an interesting study that was launched in 2025 by a group called Clarivate. They're a global analytics company, and they launched a survey called the Pulse of the Library. They surveyed over like 2,000 academic and public libraries, and the numbers were interesting because you didn't have too many libraries that were experimenting with AI with different functions like, let's just say, chatbots or recommendation systems within like our cataloging, let's just say. But what they did see were they saw two primary tracks. They saw programming was one of like the big things that was impacting AI, impacting public libraries as it pertains to generative AI, and also the experimentation of AI when it comes to reference services, dabbling in a couple of different tools that can help with behind the scenes circulation data work. But programming, without a doubt, was the biggest part. We're looking at AI literacy workshops for primarily high school students and also adults who are looking to learn more about ways that they can use generative AI to help with their resume slash cover letter building. So I think that has been the biggest impact. And also knowing that there are collaborative efforts that can be made within those efforts, like making sure that you are connecting and reaching out to other organizations that specialize in digital media literacy that infuse itself within AI, and having guest speakers come in where you're not spending a lot of money to invite them. You're engaging the audience, you're engaging your community residents, and you're maintaining a consistent level of AI engagement. I think the biggest skills for librarians, and I know this seems like a heavy lifting effort, but when it's happening in a way where it feels organic, it's not that bad. It's just learning more about AI, but it's specifically learning about the umbrella of AI, the difference between machine learning, deep learning, and generative, because a lot of people get those mixed up. Also, learning more about just generative AI, how it works, how it functions, what are the tools that can actually help public librarians, because most of them, I'm not gonna lie, are pretty trash. But then there are other tools that, in terms of specific tasks, is very helpful. I also think that when you dabble into AI politics, learning how AI capitalism and data centers are impacting the local communities, you get a better sense on how you can provide these services in terms of AI literacy workshops or just providing AI training or educational resources like we talked about on AI ethics is really, really important. And this type of learning doesn't take too much work because YouTube has a lot of awesome and free resources where you can get that streamlined connection to information. And I think it could be easily transferable to a workshop or connecting to again, local org that specializes in this and having them bring the information to the public library.
Co-sign everything Don said. I think the other thing, couple things I am seeing or hearing about, and this is usually in some of the larger public libraries, you have, some of the larger libraries are actually thinking about AI policy in relation to their library operations. So I'm thinking specifically about Las Vegas, Clark County, uh, Director Kelvin Watson is a director there. And so I heard him speak at Computers and Libraries this spring, and he spoke about the AI plan that they are adopting in their library system. I know when I was at IMLS, we funded ARL's AI futures scenarios. And one of the conversations that emerged with me and some of the public libraries that are still engaged with ARL is how does a public library, from a policy perspective, become the policy expert for your town, for your city, for, if you're a state library, for your state government. So those are sort of the conversations that I'm hearing about AI. I will say that I taught public libraries in person, and when I talked about AI in my public libraries class, I got booed. And I had to tell them boo, but, and it was just a jump off point for us to talk about like digital justice. But yeah, so as Don said, it's a mixed bag of chips when it comes to AI.
Well, if I can jump in, Cindy said two of my favorite words, policy, and I think you implied another one of my favorite phrases, collection development. And I think that one of the things that we surprisingly are seeing become an issue in libraries and public libraries in particular, but it's entering the academic library space as well, are the contents of AI generation. So here we're talking about books and other media that were created by AI, and libraries don't necessarily or haven't yet developed collection development policy that allows or disallows that kind of material to enter into a library's collection. As it's all over the place, it's possible that someone might be interested in an AI generated X, Y, or Z. So, how does a librarian deal with a reference question in which someone is asking for something that, as you investigate further, you discover is not created by a human, but is instead created by a machine? So, here is where I think libraries that are thinking ahead or are racing to stay apace should probably think a lot about their collection development policies and how those account for IA created materials.
Thank you all for the response on that. I feel like we'll probably come back to this topic in general Q&A. And I just wanted, Don, when you mentioned something about you were talking about like AI ethics. And I think you were talking about like data centers and the impact on communities. This like comes to like what always excites me. Like I don't know anything about AI. It is not my wheelhouse, but my wheelhouse often is like that whole like community advocacy and like how can libraries be a part of that? So on like one hand, like my response to the whole AI discussion in libraries is still use again yourself as this forum to like not only inform and educate people on this topic of AI, but to use yourself as a forum, like you said, to bring in guest speakers. And maybe the angle is from this AI ethics. And that's how you feel good about embedding AI and the learning and education piece into like what you're doing as a library, but also feeling like you're providing like a public service or aspect of social justice to your community. So I think there's a lot of angles you can take on this, and you each touched on that. So thank you. I'm going to keep going because we're starting to get a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure we can get to them. So the next question is, so this is about challenges to materials and programs, which are increasing, and it's a really great timing because today at the State House, the bill is in front of the House to be voted on to provide much broader, better protections for libraries. But so as challenges to materials and programs are increasing, as is the heated rhetoric, how can the field respond to these while remaining true to our ethics and values? What do students and new professionals need to know?
I could grab this. I would love to speak on it. And I too am very excited to hear about what happens with the bill in front of the House. From everything that I understand, it looks like a sure win. And next up after this win, it will be on Maura Healey's desk. So hopefully that will be good for us. Just for FYI, this bill that's coming through the House right now is, let's see what it's called. I was just looking at it earlier today. It's regarding free expression, and it encourages libraries to, or it requires libraries to develop collection development policies that allow for and account for the material that they are stocking in their libraries. But it also allows for or protects libraries and librarians in particular and their jobs if they are threatened by members of the public. And that's something that's really key, especially since there was another bill that was passed back in November. I think it might have been the pre preface to this one. I think if this one is, let's see, number 2726, I think the other one was like 2626. Anyway, it was really exciting to see this kind of legislation happen in Massachusetts that really protected libraries and librarians and their jobs in particular. When we know in other communities and in other states, because this is where that law happens, in other states, librarians are getting fired for decisions that they might not even have made, and that they might not have made with the full support or understanding of the library as an institution. So I think the question that we're asking, how do we respond to challenges? The easy and sort of glib answer is professionally. But what does that mean? You know, it's important that as that rhetoric, as Ali pointed out, gets heated, we don't get heated. And we work to always defend the library and its policy. In the end, when someone is questioning or challenging a book in a library's collection, you're not defending the book itself. You're defending the library's policy and the library's right to select that material and make it available to the entirety of the community. Who knows? Maybe one day someone will come up questioning a book, and you'll be like, you know what? I kind of agree with you. What do you do then? Well, that's where when we put on that, oh, that's never going to happen sort of situation, as we entertain that not likely to take place, but still at the edge of possibility situation, we start to think of, okay, well, what are the limits and extents of my professional behavior in this context? What am I protecting, if not my opinions? Well, we can protect our opinions and our right to express them by protecting and advocating for the library's right to select material for the public. And that right and the extent to which they select material and how exactly they do it are in a library's collection development policy, which should be very explicit and detailed, and should describe everything from who is responsible to where they find material and how ideally they deal with those challenges. And every librarian should make it a practice to, the first day on their job, look at all of their library's policies. And if they're involved in collection development or frontline services in any way, should look at the library's collection development policy. And if you find that collection development policy very slender, or and gang, I have to tell you, I have looked at a lot of collection development policies in my life. There are many, many bad, slender ones out there, some of them even in the state. If you find that your library is one of them, it doesn't mean your library is bad. It means people have been busy serving the public and haven't had a chance to get involved in that policy yet. But you know what? You can be the change agent. You can be the person who says, you know what? I'm really interested in policy. And as somebody who's working in X, Y, and Z, I'd really like to get involved in the next revision of our library's X, Y, and Z policy. How do I do that? And then you keep being that person who mentions it. And then you're on the ground when the policy change happens. And then you make the library safer for you, your fellow workers, and your community. Sorry, as you can see, I do get very excited when we talk about policy and collection development. So I will just stop right now.
I just
So,
want to, oh, sorry, go ahead,
oh, no,
Don.
no, 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 please, please.
I was just going to draw attention to in the Q&A, somebody kindly pointed out MBLC's legislative agenda, which references those bills. So if you want to go read and have direct links, you can go on to our legislative agenda on our website, or just click on the link in the Q&A.
No, it's okay. I think that the underlying theme involving this entire conversation, as we're talking about multiple subject areas within the future of LIS, well, particularly public libraries, and what we can do about it, is policy development. It is huge. Policy development also is coupled with procedures and knowing what to do when a situation happens at your front desk. And it's always scary when we're dealt with these very intense moments. And I would also say that it depends where you are regionally because you have more book bans that are happening in other areas of the country, particularly in the South, Midwest, and learning more about the different types of libraries you serve is key. But in the beginning, when we talked about those critical skills and what Amy just mentioned, when you have a diesel policy and procedure, and when you also have those skills on de-escalating, it is hard when a random Karen comes into your library talking about this people of color book or this book that they have a problem with. And then for you to know the procedure, and there's nothing that they can really do after you quell that frustration, and then you refer to them to whatever policy they need to follow, whether it's a form that they have to fill out or a process where they will receive a follow-up with their complaint, their concern, because after that, it's done. Unless that person just really wants to scream at your face, which happens. But knowing that, to Amy's point, staying cool as a cucumber and not matching that level of frustration and anger is something that requires a form of like developed skill and is difficult. And again, it's very scary. But I think as we start thinking about the more of these things, it may not happen in your career, which God bless, because it's really, really stressful. But as we start thinking about more on how these things may come to light, I think that part is really key as we move forward in an increasingly polarizing space. And while libraries are in real time being under attack, and you have both social issues that are infusing themselves within the library, and we're also getting like community pressure and also legislative local government pressure as well, again, depending on where you're located. So,
I want to add something. As someone who has had to deal with not a collection development issue, but as many people know, I've had my foray into the drag queen story hour debacle. One of the things I think about the policy, yes, tight policy, clear guidelines, but also educating the public about the collection development policy.
mm,
Many people do not understand that policy from, how a book is selected, with the processes to how one actually leaves the shelf because we've had in our time in libraries lots of controversies about weeding materials as well. And I would say building coalition is very, very important. Oftentimes, when you're facing these challenges, especially if they're an organized group of random Karens who are actively, systematically and coordinated efforts to do this work, you have to also think about a systematic and coordinated response with people in your community because it always helps to have a cheer squad.
And I'm just going to use this time to shout out the Intellectual Freedom Social Responsibility Committee in Massachusetts, which falls under the Massachusetts Library Association. Andrea Fiorillo, who has chaired that for years now. If you've got questions, if you have a challenge, if you're just not sure where to even start with like updating your policy, she is such a force and such a she's just so her expertise and her knowledge is invaluable. So definitely look that up. Um, Next question. We have two more questions, and I do see the time. But the next question is, how should library management and administration prepare their organizations to respond to trends like emerging technologies and changing landscapes in which libraries have to operate?
I guess I'll jump in and take this one. I'll start. So I think there's a couple of things that management, and I will differentiate between management and leadership because anybody, in my opinion, can be a leader in a library. We have many leaders in libraries, but positional leaders, managers, directors, one, they themselves can make sure they actually understand what the trends are. I think that's super important that they have some clue about what is happening. They don't have to necessarily be experts, but they at least have to be knowledgeable. I also think they have to operate as chief enablers. You can't know everything, But there are people on your, in the library, people that you work with, very talented people who can engage in that learning and who are excited about it. And if given the opportunity, can bring that learning to the fore in your organization. I think how we prepare our organizations to be adaptable is that we are adaptable, that we don't lock ourselves into, as I used to like to tell my colleagues in the library, I cannot guarantee that the same five things you've been doing for the last 5 years will be the same five things that you're going to do in the next 5 years. And being honest about the reality that things are changing and they're changing quickly. And honestly, as a leader, saying, some days I don't know. I really don't know. But just trying to build an adaptive spirit in your library is really, really important. And making sure that you at least have some knowledge of what in the world is going on in our field is important in making that investment.
Question to follow up on that. So with like managers, like leadership, people who've been in the field for a bit, what would be, so we know we're like new or emerging librarians are going to get their education, and then we know that there's professional development out there. But what are maybe some tips or advice for, your long-termers or people in higher positions to avoid becoming complacent and making sure that they're also pursuing their continuing education?
So I would say the same places that newer librarians are looking to get educated and to connect with these ideas. I think as a leader, you should be a learner, right? So, when you're in those environments, it doesn't matter whether you're the director or you're the manager, you still have capacity to learn new things. I also would say that looking outside of our field is a really good thing to do because as a leader, an organizational leader, how you think about bringing these things into the library is really important, and thinking about how the library sort of lives in a bigger world than just the library, because it's an organization that engages and interacts with a whole lot of other organizations, we hope, and is impacted by other drivers in the environment. So, I mean, I think that, yes, going to conferences is important for a leader. It just may not be that you're going to, for example, an ALA or to the State Library Association conference, but there are tons of other learning opportunities for leaders that can be very, very important, sort of open up your mind to new ideas. And so, I would say yes, look in libraries, but also look outside of libraries. There's a lot, you want to learn about AI? I think Don laid out all the ways that you could engage and learn about AI, or, to Amy's point about policy development, there's a ton of places that you can learn about them as a general practice and then bring those ideas back to the library.
Thanks, Cindy. So I'm going to jump to the Q&A in our Q&A box. I know our last question, we kind of answered our last question that was in, so I'm going to jump. And since we just kind of started to talk about AI, somebody way back when had mentioned Pulse of the Library, and this is my one thing I really don't like about webinars is you can't just pop things into the chat. So if you go into the Q&A, there's a link there, and that really talks about just like it's like a global survey of AI in public, academic, and national libraries. So definitely check that out. So first question, and I'm just going to go in order. So these are going to kind of bounce around on topic. If I'll try and organize them a bit. It seems like modern librarianship in public libraries is really starting to overflow into community and social services. What do you think about a combined MLIS social work degree? That's the question. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that I am in intellectual minority here. I do feel as if I, I I do not support that kind of work in libraries. And the reason I do is because libraries and librarians aren't trained to do that kind of work. We're ultimately doing a disservice to our patrons when we take on the mantle of social worker without training. And I think one of the saddest things that we have learned and that librarians have experienced on the front lines is the fact that the social network and the social our social systems that help or attempt to help some of our least resourced fellow humans are falling apart. This should be a call to action for us. We should all be storming the State House and demanding the reinstatement of daycare centers for adults who are experiencing homelessness, for families. We should be working, there's a legislative breakfast that happens with library leaders. I think it happens every year around January. This is an opportunity for all of us to work together and talk about the challenges that keep us from doing our job, which is providing information. And that does indeed, as Cindy pointed out, overlap with human services. But there is, in my way of thinking, there is a barrier that we're not equipped to step in to fill. And right now, we as librarians are working to fill it. And I think we would be better served working with our communities to petition our legislature to reinstate and make more robust social services for our fellow humans.
I know this also opens up a can of worms in terms of the state of public librarianship when it comes to burnout, lack of pay, and lack of legislative support within local townships, cities, and elsewhere. And I do want to really give Amy a shout out for highlighting, like, hey, listen, there's a difference between social work and public librarianship. And I know I mentioned social work and sorry, serving the role as like a social worker, but to clarify, because I don't want to intimate that we become social workers. I think the nature of making sure that the communication is there between public librarian at the front line and the patron is key, but it's always good to pivot to a professional when something happens and to stay ready just in case a, God forbid, disaster happens where you have to give someone or administer a Narcan as an example. But to Amy's point, what typically happens is that there is this, we get poured into our library, the lack of services that are happening within our local area, and we tend to kind of carry that brunt of all of this work that becomes extremely hellacious when it comes to not only our jobs, but also our emotional and mental psyche. And I think it is important to know that even though knowing these skills are important, I wouldn't, to expound on what I mentioned earlier, I think it's also important to know that when you feel the time is right in that crisis moment to pivot so a professional can come in and then help ameliorate the issue or to help support that issue. Because to Amy's point, I mean, there's so much we can do as librarians. And if we're going to include social work, then shoot, I better get more dollars on the they better pay me more to do the work that I'm doing. That's a whole different setup in terms of union contracts and those negotiations. So yeah, I definitely want to add that too.
It's another master's degree too. So even,
More debt, it's nasty work.
yeah,
So, as
indeed.
someone who has stood up an entire social services, human services department in a public library, which had a separate social worker. So there was a whole team with social workers and human services individuals. I think, speaking specifically to the question about the dual degree, I think the question I would have with the dual degree, if I'm hiring you, am I hiring you to be the librarian or the social worker? And I think that is where there is a bit of a challenge because what I can imagine in some environments out of sheer necessity that there would be a lack of clarity about what your actual role is. Am I working a reference desk, reading to children today, doing technical services, and then, you know, providing assistance to individuals who need to get contacted with their local mental health professional. So I think it's where it is a good potentially a good thing is that the person who might undertake this dual degree could go into a library environment working as a social worker and have a unique understanding of the library environment. But I think it could become a little contentious if there's not clarity about, what am I being hired to actually do as a job?
And just to kind of close out this question a bit, for those on this session that know me or know like my work, it's always been really deeply embedded in social services and libraries from a librarian lens, and something that I've been raising with actually the Committee for Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility is we need to do what we did for intellectual freedom for that social service side. And to Amy's point, at these legislative breakfasts, yes, it's important to highlight the good work that people do, filling those gaps or supporting patrons in need. But you almost have to change the narrative a bit to advocate for like why this can't just fall in the laps of libraries. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is a little different, but also it's about like like how are we preparing, especially like new students, new librarians? And it said there's a lot of proprietary software that librarians have to learn on the job. So like Spring Share products, ILS, OCLC, database, admin, da 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 da. One of the frustrations is that newly degreed librarians have to learn all of this on the job. Um, Even though they've just gone through their MLIS degree. What do you think about getting some of this software into library schools so that students can demo it while they're learning?
Is someone offering us some free sandboxes? Because if they are, call me. Um, that's yes, person who has that question. That's it is a very big challenge, and I'm not being facetious when I say if you have any kind of connection and can offer us the technical support and for those types of sandboxes, they would be welcome and valued. I think, however, it also speaks to a larger issue as regards technological instruction or technology instruction. We're seeing as the generations progress different technological needs and instructional needs. And I hate to be one of those people who does kind of just segregate the population into different generations like Alpha, Millennial, and Generation X. But I think we can also say that by generation, people have faced have been differently educated under, say, no Child Left Behind, and have received different types of technological education. Most important, I think, is not that a person knows how to use the latest Spring Share, but that a person knows how to learn about technology and feels comfortable and competent with technology enough so that they can play around with Spring Share, recognize that it has some parts that they're familiar with. And while those parts might be called by a different and proprietary name under Spring Share, they're the same as an index. They're the same as a user interface. They're the same as a search bar. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that we face as library educators is teaching students how to be active and continuous learners of technology and teaching students and reassuring them that they can be comfortable and competent users of technology when in a lot of cases it seems like, oh my goodness, this is such a tremendous cliff. How am I going to climb this mountain? Well, you can climb this mountain, and the chances are you're a lot better at it than you think you are already.
Thanks, Amy. Um, we're going to shift again to back to kind of AI, and this is about policy too. So the question is, can anyone share examples of collection development policies that address AI generated materials or readings that address what we should be thinking about? This person's mid-process of updating their collection development policy. And somebody had responded to that saying to check out. So the Massachusetts library system has a whole LibGuide that contains examples of library policies. So to make sure that you check that out too as a resource. But I don't know if any of you have other examples you'd like to give.
I have to admit, this one is it's pretty new on the agenda, and so I don't have any examples. However, I would really strongly encourage, as your library is wrestling with policy, I would strongly encourage your library to think about those questions that motivate policy development in general, and think about like, what is our library? Who is it for? What needs is it meeting? And where and how might it make room for or disallow the inclusion of AI generated material? I think one of the first things that a library needs to do is figure out its identity and its attitude vis-a-vis AI generated material. And from there, move to incorporating it into its collection development policy. I don't think it's a one size fits all thing, unfortunately.
Yeah, so yes, I definitely agree with Amy. It's not really a one size fits all from the policies that I've seen, especially from the policies that I share in the AI course. Most of them address everything in one document. And one of the big sections that's included within an existing policy from a public library are the appropriate ways that the public library approves of AI use, whether it's for library staff or for patrons using it, and the ways that they disapprove it. And I think it all depends on not only where you stand as a library with your ideology, but also the need of the community and what they're looking for. But I do suggest, to Amy's point, start with the AI task force. I think that's the biggest thing. Like just start there. And even if like the plans are a little bit messy, the really important thing to consider is to have each individual person within that task force is to focus on an element of the library that you believe is important to touch on when it comes to specific generative AI. AI as a whole exists within our libraries. So it's more so the generative part. And then addressing that need or what you feel is necessary to touch on within a policy. And you can infuse collection development within one document that covers other subject areas within your library, or it could be specific to collection development. And also, Amy mentioned a great point as well. Collection development AI policies are kind of scarce. Like it's hard to find something specific to collection development. It's all within one kind of guideline. But just having it out there and then also including at the bottom, we will uh, review this policy and update this policy quarterly or yearly is really important, especially for your team as well. So you know that that task force is addressing new and upcoming things that are happening within the space of your library.
With the 3 minutes we have left, I'm going to try and get to the last two questions as quickly as we can. The one, Cindy, it's for you, is where can I find more information about your futures work?
Well, there's a whole dissertation in the Simmons archive, and well, it's embargoed in ProQuest, but in the archive there's one. But also, actually next week, I am doing a futures, well, tonight I'm doing a futures workshop for Nicole Cook's Black History of Black Librarianship course. And then I'm also running a futures workshop to get the students to think about the future of Black librarianship. And there'll be an article that will come forth from that probably later in the fall. But if your question is also about what is futures work and how do I learn more about it, I am happy to share with whomever some resources that can help you in your curiosity and learning and thinking about the future.
Cindy, I'll reach out and maybe there's things I can include when I send out resources. so that we can share that with everyone. And with the 2 minutes we have, I'm going to blend together two questions, which basically is asking how are library schools, or how have library schools adapted to current times? And then the other question, which is a little different, is have we seen different models, say at community colleges offering library related degrees? So how are colleges adapting to support library services?
So I could definitely touch on the community college part real quick. Haven't seen any degrees being administered or given by community colleges, but what community college libraries do effectively is teach and share information literacy resources, not only through the sense of database research, but also how information literacy can impact their social consumption of an inundated environment that we live in. Especially with my work at WCC, we did a lot of that, and we tried our best to especially help non-traditional students to help use information literacy to essentially help them with their personal lives so they can become better researchers for their own social, personal endeavors.
I do
Thanks,
have
John.
some examples of this. Indiana, the Ivy Tech, DuPage County in Illinois, and the Maricopa County Library Systems in Arizona do some certification and possibly associate degree kinds of things, mostly on the library technician side of the house. Largely in Arizona for sure, because in tribal libraries, usually you are working with people who don't even have high school diplomas or may only have a high school diploma. And then in Indiana and in Illinois, similarly to that question about addressing the needs of rural libraries and individuals who work in rural libraries, some of those community colleges do offer some type of certification or associate's degree program usually called library technician programs.
It's 3:01. Cindy, Amy, Don, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. It was really nice to chat with you, and I hope everyone enjoyed the panel discussion. So thank you everyone for being here. I will share out resources within a few days. Thanks again.